So when Jackson's veto message is published, the National Republicans absolutely flip out. I mean, this sort of plays into the exact plan that they had in mind. They knew that he would either veto it or sign it, and if he vetoed it, they could use it to their advantage. But his veto message sort of goes above and beyond and is pretty insulting to a lot of people in the party. Nicholas Biddle, this guy that you see right here on the right, Nicholas Biddle, was the president of the National Bank. He was the president of the second bank of the United States. And so this is sort of him that Jackson's talking about when he says, that all these people that are in the bank are corrupt and they're using the money to sway elections and things like that. He's really basically talking about Nicholas Biddle. So Nicholas Biddle releases a statement saying that, this is Jackson's Manifesto of Anarchy, and he, basically calls Jackson a crazy person, says that he belongs with Robespierre and the other violent people from the French Revolution. Daniel Webster, who you see over here on the left, he says, that Jackson has not just claimed for himself the right and the responsibility to pass laws and approve laws, but he's also apparently claimed for himself all process of law creation, and he's basically acting like he's the one that creates laws when in reality that's Congress's job. Henry Clay says it's a perversion of the veto power, that this is not what the veto is meant to do. It's not meant to be able to be used to further your own political agenda. So needless to say, they're all pretty much stunned by how insulting Jackson's veto messages. So Henry Clay does exactly what he planned out to do, right? He's going to use this in the election of 1832 against Jackson. So Jackson's running for re-election as a Democrat in 1832, and Henry Clay runs as a National Republican against him. And instead of working out for Henry Clay, this ends up actually working out for Andrew Jackson. All these people who, over those 5 years of us not having a national bank between 1811 and 1816, they end up really liking Jackson's logic as to why the bank is a bad thing or a useless thing. And so Jackson ends up being reelected in a total landslide. So Jackson's really got two options at this point, right? He can let the bank just dissolve on itself in the next 3 to 4 years, or he can be petty and he can go after it now. And obviously Andrew Jackson, being petty, is going to take that option. So he sets out to kill the bank immediately. So he tells the Secretary of Treasury to pull all the money out of the national bank and put it in state banks, essentially rendering the national bank useless because it would have no money in it. And the Secretary of Treasury is like, no, I'm not doing that. That's illogical. It's going to run, it's eventually going to dissolve itself anyway. You're making a political statement here that I'm not going to be a part of. And Andrew Jackson's like, okay, that's fine, you're fired, and instead I'll just do it myself. So he fires the Secretary of Treasury and sets out to just do it alone. So he takes all the money out of the national bank, and he puts it into state banks, only particular state banks. So we call those Jackson's pet banks because those were sort of his favorite ones. A lot of them were located in big southern cities, obviously Jackson being a southern man. So shortly after, that by really 1836, the bank is essentially rendered useless. In the winter of 1833, Nicholas Biddle, attempting to retaliate against Jackson for taking all the money out of the national bank, he places all these restrictions on the economy. He pulls back loans and hikes up interest rates and things like that, which sends our country actually into a very sharp recession in the winter of 1833 and into the beginning of 1834. We're really struggling economically because of what Nicholas Biddle did. In March of 1834, Henry Clay, still pissed off about everything that has happened, convinces the Senate to censure Jackson, which is sort of like writing him a ticket, basically a warning saying, hey, what you're doing is an abuse of power and you need to watch out. And Andrew Jackson, instead of saying, okay, well, I guess I'll sort of try to mind my P's and Q's, he's like, are you kidding me? You don't have the right to do this. I'm the president of the United States. When in reality, they do have the right, because the Constitution gives the Senate the power to sort of check the president by impeachment. And that's sort of They haven't impeached him, but this is along the path of impeachment. And Henry Clay is just exercising the right that the Constitution lays out for them, but Andrew Jackson doesn't really care. He still sees himself to be the centerpiece of the government. So by the time we get to 1836, the bank is not rechartered, and it's essentially made useless. And Jackson starts an investigation into Nicholas Biddle and all the people who had been working at the bank, because they realized that, not one person should be able to, especially someone who's not elected. Nicholas Biddle was appointed to his job, not elected. And no one should be able to just, with the flick of a wrist on a piece of paper, be able to send our economy into such a sharp depression. So they end up doing a lot of investigations into how all of that is set up. And today the person who's the head of the Federal Reserve has very different powers from the person who was the president of the Bank of the United States. So Jackson finally won, and by the time we get to 1836, he officially killed the bank. The bank is dead. But out of this comes a new political party called the Whig Party, and WHIG, and these are basically all the people who hate Andrew Jackson. It is kind of all of the people, there's some Federalists in the Whig Party, some National Republicans, some nullifiers. We'll talk about who nullifiers are in a second. But pretty much, if you don't like Jackson, welcome to the Whig Party. So the third thing you should think of when you think about Andrew Jackson is the Nullification Crisis. So when you think of Jackson's presidency, you should think of Indian removal, the Bank War, and the Nullification Crisis. So if you remember from previous units, a tariff is a tax on imports. Okay, so in 1816, the U.S. passes a tariff on British goods, basically trying to encourage people to buy things made inside the United States. It makes sense. We were starting our own, industrial revolution. We want to encourage people to buy from inside the U.S. to keep that going. In 1824, they raised the tariff. Then in 1828, they raise it again. So by 1828, the tariff is pretty high, and the South has a nickname for this tariff. They call it the Tariff of Abominations. What they mean here is, this is a horrible thing. This is really bad for the Southern economy. This is bad for the South as a whole. They cannot stand this tariff for several reasons. One, they used to be able to buy cheap things from Great Britain. Now they have to buy expensive things from the North. They don't like that. But also, this threatens the trade relationship between the South and Great Britain. Great Britain's having their industrial revolution also, and at this time, we're the largest producer of cotton in the whole world, and a large buyer of our cotton is Great Britain. And if we keep raising a tariff on them, eventually Great Britain might have to place a tariff on us, hurting the South's business also. The North, on the other hand, they love the tariff. This is really great for them. That's spurring so much business for the North. So we're seeing, the economies, the two different economies in the North and the South, and the two different political environments of the North and the South are really going to play a significant role here in this tariff dispute. So this looker right here is John C. Calhoun. He's the Vice President of the United States. He's Andrew Jackson's vice president, and he's from South Carolina. So if he's from South Carolina, he's definitely going to be anti-tariff, so he hates the tariff. But he knows that he can't really do anything about it because the vice president's job is essentially useless. And what John C. Calhoun does support, though, is the idea of nullification. If you remember from back when, in the last unit, we learned about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which nullified the Alien and Sedition Acts. Nullification is the idea that a state can nullify or declare void a federal law. And a lot of people believed in this idea. Remember, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they did it. This wasn't something that a few anarchists believed in. This is something that a lot of our founding fathers thought was just a totally legal way for a state to protest a federal law. John C. Calhoun said that it prevented the tyranny of the majority. So this debate on whether or not nullification is legal eventually bleeds itself into Congress, and we have this huge debate in Congress that we call the Hayne-Webster debate between these two guys, Senator Robert Hayne and Senator Daniel Webster. Webster, remember, from the bank war with Andrew Jackson. So Webster, being from Massachusetts, supports the tariff, which means he is anti-nullification. Robert Hayne is against the tariff, which means he is pro-nullification. So, Robert Hayne basically says things along the lines of, we're a union of states, and that's where the federal government gets their power from. They get it from the states, and this is a logical thing that the states should be allowed to do. They should be able to nullify a law like this, and this preventing a state from doing this is sort of like tyranny, and it's going to cause a lot more problems in the long run. Daniel Webster, on the other hand, says, we're not a union of states, we're a union of people. And if one state nullifies a law, it's just not compatible with our government, because it undermines the authority of our government, makes one state seem higher or more important than the others, which isn't something we want. So, as if things weren't bad enough, in 1832, Congress decides to raise the tariff. So the same year that Jackson vetoes the bank bill is the same year that the Trail of Tears occurs, and it is the same year that the Nullification Crisis happened. So a pretty wild year, 1832. So they raise the tariff, and predictably, South Carolina passes a bill that nullifies the law. And in that bill, it basically says, like, hey, we're not going to participate in this tariff. We're not paying this. We're nullifying this. But P.S., if we are forced to obey this law and to pay this tariff, then we might have to begin seeking the establishment of a separate government. And what they mean there is that they're threatening to leave the Union. They're threatening to secede. Obviously, if you know anything about the Civil War, obviously, eventually, South Carolina will secede and they will leave the Union, but not quite yet. But they're threatening to do so here. This is the first time that that threat is out there. And this is sort of the closest we come to Civil War until we get to the Civil War. This is the closest we've come to Civil War up until this point in history at all. So now the ball is in the executive branch's department, right? Are they going to enforce this, or are they not going to enforce this tariff? So John C. Calhoun is so torn between South Carolina, his home, and his job as vice president that he ends up resigning and taking up his post as a senator from South Carolina to help push the idea of nullification and help support it. So now it's up to Andrew Jackson. What's Andrew Jackson going to do? Well, Andrew Jackson gets Congress to pass a bill called the Force Bill, and the Force Bill essentially gives Andrew Jackson the power to use soldiers to enforce the tariff. So he's calling South Carolina's bluff here, because they said if he did that, they would secede from the Union, and he's basically saying, all right, go ahead, let's see what you got. So, that should have been this slide. That's what Jackson's move is. He passes the Force Bill. So obviously all compromises, right, all problems always will be solved by Henry Clay. So Henry Clay comes to the rescue and is like, hey, everyone calm down. No one needs to send troops anywhere. No one needs to secede from the Union. I have a plan. And he sits down and he writes out what we call the Compromise Tariff of 1833. And what that does is it lowers the tariff over the next 10 years. The tariff will drop a little bit. And so this helps the North because it's not, an immediate drop in the tariff, like the tariff's immediately gone away and they're going to lose all this money, but it's also not keeping the tariff as high as it is. And it is sort of like a sign of good faith for the South. Even Abraham Lincoln recognized that Henry Clay was really one of the main people holding our country together as we get to the Civil War. He said that as long as Henry Clay was alive, the Civil War would never happen, because Henry Clay would always be there to sort of pick up the pieces and help us out.